Christopher Spelman is the composer of Armageddon Time. I'm David Buchanan with Gold Derby. Christopher, I wanted to start by asking you about the period of the film because it's set in 1980 New York City, Queens. So I just wanted to ask you, what do you remember of 1980, and how do those memories impact, the kind of influences for the score of this film, if they did?
Let's see. I mean, I remember 1980 as a time when New York was still, it could be a scary place. A really amazing, fascinating place where I was super happy to be. But it was a place where you could run into chaos really pretty much anywhere. I was going to school at the time, and it was, if you went, especially if you were out at night, it was, you were going to meet somebody that was like not your average run-of-the-mill American somewhere along the line. That's for sure. The music of the time, which you hear in the in the needle drops and so forth, was really kind of still transitional in terms of, like, in some ways punk had already made its mark and was being like replaced with something less dynamic and vital. And in terms of, it's interesting, I don't know whether the mood of New York at the time changed anything about what the music that I composed for the movie, but I'm sure it impacted the sense of something. There's always something beyond what's right in front of you that might be a whole lot different from what you're seeing right now. There's a screen, and behind the screen, who knows what there is.
Yeah, and we'll talk about some of the influences in the film itself, but I just wanted to ask you about your partnership with James Gray. You've done so many films together over the years. So I just wanted to ask you first, what is your favorite facet of collaborating with James on this film and, over the course of your career that you've worked together?
I guess that there's so much open conversation. I don't feel like he ever hesitates to tell me what he really thinks. I don't ever hesitate to tell him what I really think. That's probably the first thing that comes to my mind. I'm going to mention two more. One of them is he's extremely funny. You wouldn't necessarily know that from all of his films, though I think this one has a lot of humor in it. But he's definitely the funniest person I've ever met. And the third thing I'll mention is that he never, ever quits. Like, he is going to do whatever, ever he can to make something achieve what he hopes it will make, or what you hope it will make, or even go beyond what you thought it might be. He's tireless. And I think I love that.
It's also a theme of the film, which is really lovely, of Paul and Johnny and their kind of aspirations and dreams. I wanted to ask you, before we get into some of the scenes and some of the tracks, what was your general approach to the score when you read the screenplay, when you started seeing some of the footage, when you started to compose? What was it about this story that really drew you in, and what was kind of your the instrumentation, your ideas about how you wanted to approach the sound of the film?
Well, I'll say the first thing is that what I was most drawn to was the intimacy of Paul's world, and then as we meet Johnny, to some degree of his world, though obviously we meet him less than we do Paul, the close connection that Paul has with his grandfather, the friendship that develops between him and Johnny. And also, I thought it was very meaningful the way James made the rest of his family not just one type of person or another. They're multifaceted people with things that you love about them and things that are not quite so lovable. Also, at the beginning of the process, when I was speaking to James, he early on said, I don't think there's going to be a whole lot of music in this, which of course I'm like, damn, come on, let me do more. And he said, but I do think that because of that, each piece will be more significant. And I think the two of us together were of the same mind that whatever the score would be, it would be fairly spare to reflect the nature of the relationships. In my mind, certainly, I wanted the music to reflect like the delicacy of a child's like emotional world, where I mean, on the outside they act very boisterous and so forth and so on, but as kids, they're insecure, vulnerable in ways that adults aren't, because adults have built up their, like, the mask they wear all the time, whereas kids don't wear a mask like that in the same way. So that was very important to me as well.
Yeah, that's exactly some of the words I wrote in my notes describing the score. Delicate, really beautiful, gentle, such really kind of delicate work. And you touched on some of the questions I want to ask you next in that answer. First, Paul's relationship with his grandfather, Aaron, played by Anthony Hopkins, which is so pivotal to the film and such a heart of the film. And you've scored a number of their scenes. There are quite a few tracks that are, focused on
Right.
their meetings, which I just love. And I want to ask you about some of those in particular. But just generally, what is it about that relationship that just kind of captured your attention, and really kind of resonated with you when you sat down to actually, write these pieces?
I think a lot of it, in fact, was generated by just the warmth that Anthony Hopkins conveys on the screen. The way that he first greets Paul with that little song Tumbalalaika, that genuine warmth and tenderness and humor is like something that everybody would want when they're a child, and you would want for any child. So and I don't know whether you would be aware of this. I'm sure not every, I mean, I've known James since he was in like 7th grade. So a year after this movie was made, that's when he and I met, because I was one of his teachers. So to think of him having somebody in his life like that was really very meaningful to me. But I think it would be, it would be meaningful for any child, and you can see that as an adult, like that's what you would want for anyone, to have that much warmth, love, tenderness, and also to know that like parents aren't always in a situation where they have like even the energy to like be displaying that, like. So I think that's really the first thing that caught my attention, is that first scene with the grandfather.
Another great scene between grandfather and grandson is launching the rocket. That beautiful, we have that beautiful kind of tender moment where he's teaching Paul, kind of right and wrong, and then that beautiful kind of that scene of them launching the rocket. Talk about scoring that, because the track that I think accompanies it, Flushing Meadow, correct me if I'm wrong on
Yeah, no,
on the
that's the
track.
one.
It's just wonderful and lovely. It has such an ethereal quality, and a sense of wonder. It really kind of opens up from some of the other tracks in the score. So just talk about, choosing how to score that moment, because it's really pivotal in the film.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say it's weird when you're in the middle of creating something like for the whole score, you believe that like everything you're going through, all the things you're trying to accomplish and all the concerns you have are going to stick with you like permanently. I have to confess right now, there were a few scenes that James didn't think there would be music or should be music, and I thought there should. But I by now have forgotten which ones are which. In my mind, I don't think he wanted music in that scene. I could be wrong. He might correct me if you were to ask him. But it did seem to me that you needed to have something there to not reestablish the tenderness, but I mean, one of the things I really loved about the scene is that the grandfather, though he's never unkind to the child, doesn't let him off the hook. Like you're raised better than that. He uses swear words. Yeah, you got a problem. I mean, I loved that. I loved it that he's like it might be the first time ever that the child has had the grandfather like really reprimand him, because we've seen the grandfather at the dinner table in that crazy dumpling scene just like sit there. He corrects the kid a little bit, but he doesn't really say much when the kid goes off and like torpedoes the dinner with those dumplings. So for all we know, this is the first time he's ever really spoken harshly to Paul. And of course, he's in character, so it's not like he becomes vicious, but he doesn't really pull punches either. And then when they launch the rocket, you know, so even though I think I was the one who said we should have music there, I'm pretty sure James was like, well, let's like, we don't, you know, if you keep the guitar there, let's keep it even more simple than let's say the piece at the beginning when Paul's walking home. And it was James who just suggested that we should have like strings there, try the strings out. And I was happy with the piece, but I didn't like when I was composing it to the scene, they did not yet have the rocket, like that rocket CGI'd in yet. So it wasn't until, and even at Cannes, I don't think the rocket was there at Cannes, or if it was, the sound mix by Cannes was not good. So they had to like fix the sound between Cannes and the actual release, and we actually added some music, though I think that music was already, but you couldn't really hear it very well. So I think it was at the NYFF when I first saw it and heard it as it was supposed to be, and I was like, oh, I didn't realize that they had set the strings to start when the parachute opens, and I felt like I almost felt like, well, people may think, well, that's a great moment you scored. I wasn't aware that's when when it was going to be, so I don't really get any credit for that because I think it works beautifully.
Yeah, it does. It is a great moment. And I'm jumping a little bit ahead chronologically in the film, but since you're talking about strings, I want to ask you about the pawn shop sequence and your music for that, because it's another really pivotal and important moment in the film. And you just immediately in that track, there's such a kind of tension and a sense of dread. It really is a very kind of consequential moment in the life of these two children, Paul and Johnny. Just talk about, again, somewhat different from the kind of the sound of the rest of the score, but really impactful moments. So talk about your kind of ideas around that, scoring that moment.
Yeah, so at that point, I mean, it was clear that scene was going to be like the first step towards disaster. Like, not, I mean, obviously you could say it was a disaster. That was such a stupid idea to take the computer in the first place, but it's the point of no return, where, as we'll eventually learn, like Johnny is never going to recover from this. So it truly did have to have some disquieting effect. And I also saw it as the point at which the world beyond their fantasies and their own private emotions, like, is disrupted by reality. And for that reason, I wanted it to have like not just more instrumentation, but harmonies we haven't heard before. And obviously, it's like there's at least semi-dissonant harmonies, but the very fact that there were like it was a chord with a lot of notes that don't necessarily easily fit together. I wanted that to suggest like a sort of way that the world has suddenly taken a turn on its axis that's shifts them into a new reality.
Yeah, that comes across really well. And I think that is true of all of the work that you've done around Paul and Johnny's relationship, because it changes the most over the course of the film. There's a great track also at the fence where we really kind of see a really big change in dynamic, just because Paul has gone to a different school. Their relationship can't be what it once was. Just talk about, your approach to tracing that evolution of those character dynamics in music over the course of the film.
Yeah, I mean the melody that you hear when Paul's walking home in the first one, we hear parts of that at different points. The melody that begins at the fence is a different melody, and I used it twice and in my mind I associated it more as Johnny's melody rather than Paul's. And at the fence, as that scene begins to go wrong and sort of abandons or refuses to acknowledge Johnny, or however you would want to put it, I feel as though the way it's filmed, you can see that Johnny both does perceive what's happening, but doesn't want to admit to himself what's happening. And so it's obviously a very vulnerable moment for him. So I wanted that melody to that we first hear there to be reflective of his like tragic reckoning of something really wounding. And then the second part of it picks up the second part of the melody that we've already heard with Paul, which then follows him inside to the gap session that he has with the teacher. And then we hear that melody again when Johnny's out in the clubhouse and he goes into Paul's house to sort of like figure out, it's not like 100% clear what motivates him to go in, because Paul said, I'll come out and give you it's either blanket or bandage or something along those lines, but he goes in anyway. And that I use that melody there to sort of emphasize that we're seeing that scene at least partly from Johnny's point of view, and that he's seeing what Paul's world is. Paul has kind of bullshitted him about what his world is, like I'm rich and this, and I think it's funny. I mean, because is Paul bullshitting him, or does Paul really think he's rich? I don't think you can tell. Paul, like a sixth grade kid, Paul's sort of an idiot. Like that's not natural for them. So, but that he sees Paul being, like unwittingly humiliated by his parents, or especially his father, who doesn't know he's there. I mean, so Johnny sees something of Paul's world that he hasn't seen before. And then it's used again in the scene with when Paul and his father are in the car after the police station. And I wanted to use it there because Paul has just everybody's telling him, leave Johnny behind. He just left Johnny behind, but the music is the music we've heard from when we've seen Johnny before. So that was intentional as well.
Yeah, there's so many more questions I could ask you about the film. It's so rich as you're, laying out the character dynamics, and the characters are so fascinating and complex. But I have to let you go. Christopher Spellman, congratulations on the film
Well,
Armageddon
thanks.
Time, and thank you so much for talking to Gold Derby today.
Sure. Thank you. Bye.